Welcome back, everyone, to the second half of our look at the series on the end of the samurai by Extra History. We took a look at parts 1 and 2 of their series in the first episode, this reaction. Today we're going to take a look at 3, 4, and 5. It's a fascinating topic. It's one I'm still learning a lot about, and I hope that you're learning as well. I'll put the link down in the description to the original 5-part series complete, as well as to the first part of my commentary if you missed that first episode. That way you can check it out. Before we dive in today, I want to thank Curtis in Lenoir City, Tennessee. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It could be Lenoir if it's French. I don't know, but I think it's Lenoir City. Thank you so much for your support, Curtis, on Patreon. Could not do this without you. Some exciting new stuff coming to Patreon. So patrons, make sure you're paying attention to your notifications, because in the next couple of days, you're going to get some major updates about a bunch of new perks and some new things that we're trying out with that. You're probably already seeing that by now. Let's dive into this one.
Kyoto, December 10th, 1867. Sakamoto Ryoma sits in an anonymous inn, discussing how things will soon change. A month before, the shogun Yoshinobu had accepted an 8-point proposal that handed political power to the emperor. Ryoma had written that proposal, yet the transition is not complete, and his friends say there's still danger. The year before, Ryoma had escaped assassination in a house much like this one, battling his way out and firing point blank on the attackers with a Smith & Wesson revolver.
So, Sakamoto was warned of the assassins by his future wife, Narasaki Ryo, who leapt out of a bathtub and ran into his room partially naked to alert him. So I love all these extra things that they're throwing up in this series. It gives you a little more detail. But one of the things, we're talking about this negotiated handover of political power to the emperor after 2.5 centuries of power from the shogunate. Just because somebody negotiates that doesn't mean that everybody who is a part of that process is behind the change, right? It's the same way in which when a nation goes to war, the reason why the political leadership of a nation might go to war is very different than why men in the ranks might fight that war. And likewise, when you negotiate something on behalf of an entire group of people, it doesn't mean all the people like it.
Suddenly, a heavy thump is heard from downstairs. His bodyguards, 2 sumo wrestlers, must be sparring again. He yells for them to knock it off. But moments later, the sliding door opens, revealing men with swords, the shogun's men. As Ryoma lunges for his katana, someone knocks over the room's lantern. And in the sudden darkness, the blades of assassins fall on Sakamoto Ryoma. On November 9th, 1867, Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu, after years of intrigue and violence, finally bowed to political reality. The restorationist Triple Alliance of Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosa provinces had a modern army to match his, and civil war was on the horizon. He could fight, or he could step down and let the Tokugawa clan retain some role in government. So he accepted the 8-point plan, written by the young radical Sakamoto Ryoma, one that amounted to the total reshaping of Japan's political system.
Right, it's an opportunity to just read the room and understand I can have no power, or I can sign off on this thing that I really don't like and still retain some level of influence within the government and hope that maybe I can grow that later.
The first point called for Yoshinobu to resign as shogun, giving full political power to the imperial court. There would also now be a 2-part legislative body.
So we're going to have no shogun then. I guess that's probably a non-negotiable first step in all of this, right? You can't have a shogun and still argue that you're handing over power to the emperor.
An upper and lower house to decide government policy based on popular opinion. It created new advisors and abolished old offices, and called for a reshaping of foreign affairs, a new legal code, an enlarged navy, an official imperial guard, and fixing the price of precious metals to the world market.
It's amazing how quickly all of this happens. And by quickly, I mean, it's a decade or so since they first opened up after Commodore Perry shows up. It didn't happen overnight. Obviously, there was a lot of this that was already going on behind the scenes, even though officially the government hadn't opened up to the world. There's still world influence that's happening. Many of these people have had that influence, and so that was all simmering under the surface, but this just opened it up. But it's incredible how quickly Japan gets reshaped, and what a shock to the system that must have been to so many people.
Wu didn't lose all of his power, though. Exactly who would perform what function and what powers the shogun would maintain was a subject of divisive debate, because the shogun's official duties were to be Japan's military leader, and Yoshinobu still had a considerable military force personally loyal to him.
So there is still a shogun in this case.
That included a core force of 900 modern infantry troops trained by a French military mission, and a modernized fleet with British naval advisors.
And that's something we talked about in the last episode, right? Is that you primarily have the French advising on the army and the British on the navy, but there are some Americans as well. One of the things that happens after the American Civil War, especially former Confederates who didn't want to stay in the United States, but also some former Union officers, they go to other places. A lot of them go to Egypt and are working for the Army of the Khedive. They're using their now gained military experience to advise other nations who are looking to modernize, who are looking to get an edge on their enemies, things like that.
He also had a power base of northern daimyo that he could rally to his cause. Indeed, many in the restorationist camp thought Yoshinobu should be brought into the governing coalition. A peaceful transfer of power would help legitimize their new government in the eyes of foreign powers. Plus,
yeah, absolutely. If you can get the people who were most vehemently opposed to this transition, if you can get them integrated into the government, this is just like what Abraham Lincoln did in the Civil War, is bringing in his strongest opponents before the war as members of his cabinet, that team of rivals concept.
just like many restorationists, Yoshinobu was reform-minded and believed in modernization. Moderates thought they could work with him, but the radicals among the restorationists, particularly Saigo Takamori, refused.
There you go. And this is where you have the issue that we always see happen in history. History rhymes, right? When everybody's working toward a common goal, they're on the same side. But the minute the goal is achieved to some degree, now the cracks start to show, and now you have the different factions fighting over things.
They wanted the shogunate dissolved, with the Tokugawa clan stripped of their lands and barred from government. It was a stalemate, and then the restorationists got tired of waiting. On January 3rd, 1868, Satsuma and Shoshu troops marched on the Imperial Palace in Kyoto and got the Emperor's guards, in reality his shogunate jailers, to stand down. Now freed to act as he wished, the 15-year-old emperor declared the restoration of imperial rule and beginning of a new era, that of Meiji.
The Meiji
enlightened
restoration.
rule. 2 weeks later, in the shogunate capital of Edo, Yoshinobu officially rejected the restorationist terms, which now included the surrender of all his lands.
So now, instead of working toward compromise, instead of bringing about peace and uniting the emperor side and the shogunate side, now you've got civil war.
Restorationist partisans burned Yoshinobu's personal palace in Kyoto down for refusing to submit, and then he responded by raising the Edo residence of the Satsuma leader Saigo Takamori. Then, Yoshinobu sailed out of Osaka Castle with his modernized force, vassal troops, and Shinsengumi. And he swore to liberate Emperor Meiji from rebel control. Because despite everything that had happened, to appear legitimate, Yoshinobu still had to claim that he was acting in the emperor's best interest.
No matter what time period we're talking about, if we're dealing with a nation, east or west, that has some form of monarchy, whether it's symbolic or real power, in the end, that is the source of your legitimacy. Happened in England, happens in France, happens throughout the Austrian empires and the Habsburgs and Spanish, and happens in Rome, all these places. I mean, in Rome, they just kind of kill their emperors. But most other places, that's an untouchable, right? You need to symbolically have the emperor, in this case, at the head of whatever movement you're trying to have.
The Boshin War had begun. January 27th, 1868, a road south of Kyoto. The shogunate advanced guard reaches a bridge, seeing a Satsuma banner and restorationist troops dug in. But their commander doesn't expect a battle. Shogunate forces number 15,000, and here there are only 5,000 restorationist defenders.
And the funny thing is, this is a way better odds than what they're going to face later on down the road when you get to Shiroyama.
He puts his feudal vassal troops with pikes in the front, and the modernized infantry behind them haven't even loaded their rifles. Then he sends a messenger to the Satsuma, saying they carry a letter to the emperor and asking for passage. The Satsuma then deny them passage and open fire. And it's here that the firepower of the restorationist force becomes apparent. The shogunate force has 2 modernized infantry battalions. True, but the Satsuma have invested in artillery. A shell from a breech-loading Armstrong gun explodes near the commander, throwing him from his horse. Then more shells fall. There's the crack-crack of rifles throwing conical bullets the size of a thumb, and then starting slow but getting faster, the lethal drumbeat of a Gatling gun. Further south, on a
So Gatling guns, they're invented early enough that a couple of them are used in the American Civil War, but they're really kind of a non-factor. But you see them a lot, especially later in the 1860s. This is technology that's starting to spread. You know, even George Armstrong Custer had a couple of Gatling guns at the beginning of his expedition that results in the Battle of Little Bighorn, and what a difference they might have made if he had decided to bring them with him.
different road. The second shogunate column is approaching another bridge. Here, too, the outnumbered restorationists are dug in, and at the sound of shooting in the distance, their guns open up as well. Shinsengumi and vassal troops charge into the smoke-wreathed bridge, into withering fire. The huge shogunate army can't take the bridges, but they also don't flee. Then, on the second day, a new battle standard appears on the restorationist lines. An Imperial brocade banner. A standard that can only be carried when the military has the express permission of the emperor and his personal sanction. Along with
huge symbolic value to something like that if it's indeed real and you have that legitimate authority.
With it comes a directive from the emperor that Yoshinobu and any who fight with him are traitors. The emperor had, with all of the powers of the state, backed the restorationists. And now, this is no longer a rebel force, it's the Imperial Japanese army. This news does what the advanced guns could not. It breaks the shogun's larger force. Men fall back, unwilling to fire on the Imperial banner. Units defect, and previously shogun-aligned daimyo lock their castle gates to the retreating army. Granted, shogunate forces had won a minor naval victory the same day, but it was cold comfort. Yoshinobu, shaken by the dramatic political turn, boarded a ship and fled to Edo. But the now Imperial forces chased him. Saigo Takamori also caught the head of the Shinsengumi in an ambush outside the shogunate capital, annihilating his force and executing him, incorrectly, for the murder of Sakamoto Ryoma. Then, the now Imperial troops surrounded Edo and took it, street by street, over the next 2 months. Yoshinobu found his options running out. In fact, his one remaining point of leverage, that foreign governments still recognize the shogunate as Japan's legitimate government, also vanished.
Imagine a nation that's been isolated for centuries and now has opened up, and your claim to legitimacy comes from the recognition of foreign powers that 2 decades ago you were hardly interacting with.
As imperial diplomats had convinced the Western nations to remain neutral and back whoever won. Then, sometime in June, Yoshinobu unconditionally surrendered to Saigo Takamori's forces and voluntarily went into house arrest at a local temple. But his admiral slipped away with the fleet, taking the most die-hard shogunate holdouts and a few French military advisors to the northern island of Hokkaido. There, they declared an American-style republic and geared up for the final confrontation.
So the Ezo Republic was Japan's first democracy, though the only samurai could vote. It only lasted 6 months.
Which is when the Imperial forces wheeled out their most powerful weapon.
A car?
Pageantry. They arranged a massive Imperial caravan to Edo at huge expense, moving the Emperor out of Kyoto for the first time in his life and installing him in the Shogun's former castle.
I mean, not only has Japan been isolated, but the Emperor has been very isolated. And this actually, to a degree, continues for a long time to come. I mean, the culture that's built around the emperor, the isolation, the hidden from view-ness of him is fascinating, and there's that degree of mystery that has always surrounded him.
There, the emperor declared that the city would be renamed to fit its new function in the post-shogunate world. It would be the
Tokyo.
Eastern capital, Tokyo. It was an enormous propaganda coup. The first time ordinary people got to see the emperor and feel his presence. Though there were still some castles to besiege and diehards to clear out, the more public the emperor became, the more defections occurred, the more resistance melted, except in Hokkaido. Miyako Bay, Hokkaido, May 6, 1869. The Shinsengumi force and their French advisor crouch on the deck of the paddle steamer, ready for their desperate operation. They're flying a U.S. flag, masquerading as a foreign ship. And they're approaching the Imperial fleet, the one sent to crush them. At its head, the brand new ironclad Kotetsu, with armor far too thick for them to penetrate.
Yeah, this is the age of ironclads now, right? It goes back to the late 1850s when you have, I think, the British and the French are the first to build ironclads. Very famously, in 1862, you have the first battle between ironclads, the Monitor and the Virginia, at Hampton Roads, Virginia, in the American Civil War. And at that point, it's all going to be about the ironclads in the post-war world.
From the outside, at least. They raise the flag of the Republic, paddle wheels churning them directly for the Kotetsu. Their guns open up at the last moment as they brace. The bow of their ship crunches into the ironclad, and a boarding party of the Shinsengumi goes over the other side. They plan to destroy or capture the Kotetsu from the inside in order to have a fighting chance in the battles ahead. But the drop to the enemy deck is steep. They can't all jump at once. And as they clamber down, one at a time, the crew of the Kotetsu shakes off the surprise of the ramming attack and heads to battle stations. The Shinsengumi surge forward with their swords and pistols as the fire of the Kotetsu's deck-mounted Gatling gun chops into them. They lose their commander. The French advisor takes 2 hits, and the boarding party breaks off the attack. The last chance of survival gone. The next day, Imperial forces, led by the Kotetsu, will destroy the Republic fleet and defeat their forces on land. The shogunate's last bastion has fallen, the Meiji Restoration complete. And with the Emperor finally winning his throne, there's only one question left. When his closest samurai turn against him, can he hold on to it?
Wow. All right, let's get into Chapter 4.
Another inn, Kyoto, October 9th, 1869. Vice Minister of War Amura Masujiro runs down the stairs, pursued by men with swords.
Why does it feel like the entire storyline of all of this is people in leadership making deals and then finding themselves running away from assassins with swords?
He bleeds from multiple wounds, including a deep one on his leg, and 2 of his friends lay dead upstairs. Wow. Omura is the man who won the Boshin War, and it was he who modernized the Choshu forces using Napoleonic tactics and peasant conscripts to topple the shogun. Now he's pushing for the same reforms on the Imperial army, but that would end the samurai as a warrior class, stripping them of their swords. The very swords they're chasing him with.
So, yeah, what we've had so far is we've had reform, but not reform that eliminates the samurai as this upper tier of the social strata, right? You know, it's one thing to give up your political power, but don't make me give up my personal social hierarchy status and make me equal with all of these other people.
He gets out the back door, but can hear his pursuers gaining on him. Desperate, he climbs into a bathtub, watching as his blood clouds the murky water.
Wow.
He puts his head underneath, and as he holds his breath for what feels like an eternity, his assassins storm past unknowingly and continue their search into the night. The Boshin War may have been over, with the shogunate toppled and the Meiji Emperor restored, but the political violence that had rocked Japan was by no means finished. And given the amount of blood spilled and bitter political divides, you might think that all began with a wave of emperor-ordered executions. But it didn't. In fact, no one was executed at all. The Tokugawa lands were seized and made part of the state, and leaders of the shogunate force were arrested and held under home confinement for a few years. But
so what often happens when you have these revolts, these civil wars, these periods of strife, is that the people who come out on top, they have a choice to make. There's really kind of 3 choices. You can make it just rampant executions and retribution and eliminate all of your opposition in hopes that will put an end to it. You can go the other extreme, which is mass forgiveness, and that's kind of the American Civil War route, right? Was that amnesty ends up being the order of the day for just about everybody in the Southern Confederacy. Just a couple of executions for war crimes and things of that nature. Or there's the middle ground where maybe you execute some of the ringleaders, but then offer amnesty to most others. And it seems like they've gone with the kind of American Civil War style of mass forgiveness and hoping that brings about a settlement.
By 1872, all were pardoned and most back working for the government. Even Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, was sent to a comfortable retirement in his domain. It was a savvy political move. The idea was
Right.
to unite the country by, essentially, taking everyone at their word that they had been fighting for what they thought was the good of the emperor.
And that requires that everyone sticks to their word. And the unfortunate reality is that a lot of things in history look really good on paper, but they can't account for human will and desires and selfishness and motivations that inevitably crop up.
The argument went that everyone had acted honorably and it was over now. In fact, victorious Imperials even celebrated the heroism of shogunate troops. For example, a group of samurai known as the White Tigers who committed seppuku when they believed their castle had fallen, praising them as examples of military valor. They even installed the spirits of all of the war dead in a common shrine. But just because there was little official punishment didn't mean nothing would change. In fact, everything would change. During the Boshin War, the emperor and his court had issued a decree known as the Charter Oath. This 5-point plan laid out the government's aims during the new Meiji era, which did involve seismic change, though was also worded vaguely enough to be flexible. The 5 points were: 1. Deliberative assemblies with decisions made by public discussion. 2. All classes would be united in carrying out state policy. 3. Common people were allowed to pursue their own calling. 4. Evil customs of the past would be discontinued. And 5. Knowledge should be sought out throughout the world and used to strengthen imperial rule.
This all seems great on paper, unless because this is going to lift a lot of people who have been born into lives that don't really allow for them to kind of climb up the ranks. But if you're one of the people that was already at the top, you're the ones that aren't happy with this.
And it was that 5th one that was really interesting, because it was essentially an official abandonment of Sonojoy.
A promise to abandon anti-foreign policies was how the Restorationists gained diplomatic recognition from Western powers during the Boshin War. Okay.
Even though the movement had brought the emperor to power, this new Japan would embrace Western technology, along with the Western experts that must be brought in to get Japan up to speed. It was also how the Imperials got the Western nations on their side.
But Western experts coming from different countries, they may be there to help get you up to speed, but obviously there's a what's in it for me factor. In many cases, it's going to be, well, you really need, say, these ships for your navy. You should buy them from our nation. Or you need these weapons to get your army up to speed. Bring in our people to train you. Bring in our weapons. Buy them from us. Oh, you need to build some steel mills. We'll give you everything you need to get started. Just buy it from our country.
During the Boshin War, no more xenophobic attacks on foreigners would be tolerated. That got in the way of the main project, strengthening the country through economic reform, infrastructure projects, industrialization, and of course, military enhancement. That old phrase, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, was out. And in was a new rallying cry, enrich the country, strengthen the military. And as you can imagine, this was not all that well received among those who'd fought on the Imperial side during the Boshin War, because their main objective was to shut foreign powers out of Japan and let the country develop along its own lines. But what the emperor and his reformist advisors now favored was the exact same foreign policy as the shogunate. To gradually renegotiate the unequal treaties, using its modernization as an argument that it should be treated equally with the other colonial powers. And while that might have disturbed traditionalists like the Satsuma leader Saigo Takamori, the government believed it had no other option. And that was the clear message brought back by the Iwakura mission, which between 1871 and 1873 sent diplomats on a tour through the United States and Europe, both to open negotiations and to study Western technology and government. 2 of the men on that mission, Okubo Toshimichi of Satsuma and Kido Takayoshi of Choshu, would return with a grim message. Japan could not survive outside pressure without modernization, trade, and industrialization. Their artisans could not compete with the cheap Western manufactured goods, and with the unequal treaties disallowing Japan from instituting any protective tariffs or import duties, their choice was to either industrialize or have an economic crash.
Right, and not only that, but if you don't get your military up to speed, then you are still vulnerable to the next great power that comes along and uses gunboat diplomacy on you. Points guns at you and then says, sign this treaty or else, or allow us to come in and trade or else. You have to be able at some point to defend yourself.
Okubo and Kido would end up with major roles in the government, known along with Saigo Takamori as the three great nobles of the Restoration, the core of a new oligarchy that controlled politics and development. And these three men and their coalition government were about to completely change what it meant to be a samurai. It was clear that the samurai system, the whole caste system of Japan in fact, was incompatible with a modern state.
Yep.
First of all, you can't have a centralized government when the country's divided up by hereditary lords. Kido especially argued it was a recipe for instability and dysfunction, so he proposed a solution. He convinced his Satsuma and Shoshu allies to voluntarily turn their domains over to the emperor, who, in turn, reappointed them as governors. From now on, they would be government employees rather than lords. Their domains would be renamed prefectures, and their samurai paid by the government rather than the daimyo himself.
And this works if everybody agrees to it, if you can get them on board. And if they are practical enough to see the writing on the wall and say, you know what, this is kind of the only real choice I have, then they'll get on board.
Indeed, the position of daimyo ceased to exist, with all former daimyo instead given a hereditary aristocratic title that did not confer land. And samurai were similarly transitioned to a class without special privileges, many of them invited to join the bureaucracy or military. Then, 2 years later, the three nobles moved on the prefecture system again, this time offering a stipend, which would later have to be converted to government bonds due to financial problems in return for many of the holdout ex-daimyo to retire, so their former domains could be consolidated into 72 prefectures. All this was met with grumbling, even armed resistance. But then came the next, more radical step. Army modernization. Now, though we talked about military modernization last episode, it would have been more accurate to discuss it in terms of weapons modernization. The Satsuma and Shoshu forces had modern guns and some new tactics, but only a few units were truly modern troops, with uniforms and rank structure. Other than that, it was a free-for-all. Samurai would go into battle wearing a Western suit with 2 swords and a rifle, or a Napoleonic uniform with a katana and a revolver.
That's the growing pains of going from one culture to another, to going from one kind of weapons to another. You have those weird hybrid times in the middle of it all.
Now, was it steampunk samurai awesome? Oh, heck yeah. But efficient? Not exactly. So weapon and uniform standardization.
Right, how do you like have uniform tactics when you have different kinds of units that have radically different kinds of weapons? You know, if you sent a modern army today in and you had one unit that was using M4 semi-automatic machine guns and another one was using, you know, like a bolt-action Springfield from 1898 or something, your tactics are going to be very different from one another. If one of them has helicopters and the other one is riding horses, completely different set of tactics.
Was on the agenda when Vice Minister of War Omura Masujiro began revamping the Imperial Japanese Army. But he believed in more than that. Omura was part of a faction that thought the samurai were incompatible with the equal society they dreamed of. He wanted to abolish the samurai, strip their special rights like killing peasants, ban all symbols of rank like their top knot and right to carry swords, and turn the army into a force of conscripted peasants. Not only would
this is a matter of saying we need to uniform everything, we need to even it all out, and that means we have to remove this special class of warriors because we need everyone to see themselves as having equal opportunities to be a warrior, to be a part of the army, and we can't have certain people who think that they're above everyone else.
Take away the necessity of a warrior class. It would dissolve the private daimyo armies that could destabilize the country or stand up to the central government, and Omura was killed for it. Because while he did survive the attack we described at the beginning of the episode, the dirty bathwater he hid in ended up fatally infecting the wound in his leg.
Wow.
As you can imagine, many samurai were furious about these reforms. But the situation didn't fully explode until 1873, when Korea refused to recognize the Meiji Emperor, leading to a debate about whether Japan should invade. But then Saigo Takamori argued that this was the perfect solution. See, the samurai were feudal lords, right? And if that wasn't working in Japan, why not just let them do that in Korea? Huh? All powerful countries have colonies after all. And the samurai, you see, could be the tip of the Japanese spear, huh? And to try to further his plan, the restless Saigo even offered to go to Korea as a diplomat and behave boorishly in order to provoke his own assassination, creating a pretext for the war. So
wow. This is a common theme in history as well. I've been using a lot of American Civil War references because it was around the same time, a decade earlier. At the beginning of the American Civil War, when the Union is facing this crisis where a third of the country has broken off to form its own country, one of the solutions that was proposed by guys like William Seward, who was the Secretary of State, was that the United States should start a war with somebody like Spain and go seize their Caribbean colonies as a way of uniting the country. And this is a similar thing here, is that, we've had all this warring going on, and okay, maybe Japan, a modern Japan, doesn't really have a place for samurai, but hey, there's Korea, and they're kind of a historic enemy of ours, and you know what? Maybe this diplomatic slight that they have thrown our way is the perfect pretext for us to go to war, and that would give the samurai somewhere to go and have what they can't have in Japan anymore.
Oh, it's not Japan's fault. Get it? It's all coming together. The government said no. Sure, they did want to invade Korea, but they wanted to strengthen the state first.
Right.
This was the final straw for Saigo. He went back to Satsuma and opened military academies for disaffected samurai, gradually cutting ties with the imperial government he helped create. This was the first step on the road to the Satsuma Rebellion and the last stand of the samurai.
All right, let's take a look at it.
A mountain cave in Kagoshima, September 24th, 1877. Saigo Takamori and his followers are drinking sake, reciting poems about loyalty and their eminent deaths.
Now, you notice the difference here is that now Saigo is dressed in more of a modern military uniform. He's not looking like a samurai.
There are only a few hundred of them left. They've been on the run for months. Below, moonlight shines on Kagoshima Bay and the castle that was once his. Flashes of artillery light the encampments below, airburst shells hammering the mountainside. Soon, the Imperial attack will come, and Saigo and his men will die. That's become clear.
And this is, I referred to it in the first episode. If you've seen the Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai, it's loosely based on this rebellion. And of course, you see it in the final charge. It's a bunch of guys with swords charging into machine guns and all of that kind of modern military equipment, but it wasn't quite like that at all. The numbers are similar, though.
His army of noble samurai, once so revered they could legally murder the lower class if they felt disrespected, have fallen before an army of peasants with rifles. And within hours, Saigo's men will advance with their swords and die with honor in the old way. The last samurai. For 5 years, Saigo Takamori, along with Okubo Toshimichi and Kido Takayoshi, had been at the forefront of reforming the Meiji state and dismantling the samurai as a class. But gradually, Saigo had grown uncomfortable with the reach of social reform. He also increasingly clashed with Okubo, who had centered more and more government powers around himself. Pressured to call a conference that would bring an agreement on forming a representative assembly, Okubo managed to create a body that was largely toothless and stacked with conservatives. His policy toward Taiwan and Korea, too aggressive for Kido, not aggressive enough for Saigo.
That's the problem, is that when you try to be the moderate, both sides demonize you being in the middle, right? The extremes always think that you're compromising, that you're weak, that you vacillate on everything, and you really just end up angering both sides.
And both men to resign from government. The three great nobles of the Restoration had divided. So, Saigo retired to his lands in Satsuma. He grew crops, hunted, wrote letters, and spent time with his grandsons. He also swore off politics. Though that in itself was a political statement, and Saigo had already become such a powerful symbol of the old ways that his silence was correctly interpreted as a criticism of the Meiji state.
So Saigo played his true feelings close to the vest. As a result, historians find it hard to separate his true beliefs from the roles he performed for political or social reasons. That's tough, Even we're not talking about that long ago. absent any concrete evidence, it's really sometimes difficult. We talked about this recently in talking about the Battle of Verdun and trying to understand what Falkenhayn's real intentions were with Verdun, right? After the battle, he claimed that his intention was to bleed France white, but because we don't have evidence of him saying that at the beginning, we're left to speculate whether or not it's true. And unfortunately, some things in history will just always remain mysterious to us.
Which, in his opinion, was adopting all of the wrong things from the West. For example, he admired Western military and government institutions, but felt that the private ownership of land would incite greed and cause wealth disparity as poor farmers sold their land to the rich during bad harvests.
Wait, what's with the random weird-looking, gray, grimace-looking guy in the back?
And cause wealth disparity as poor farmers sold their land to the rich during bad harvests. He favored Japan's traditional feudal model of land division. And possibly because of this, he engaged in another pursuit besides hunting and fishing: running military academies. They were sprouting up all over Satsuma, with samurai students learning artillery, swordsmanship, and Confucian principles. These academies became a magnet for radical ex-samurai who were angry at the central government. The most hardcore dissidents who believed that samurai should keep their swords and top-knot hairstyles that were now illegal, with some even believing they should still be able to execute peasants for showing disrespect. These were the disaffected, the samurai who'd failed the transition to military or bureaucracy, or had quickly squandered the lump of pension that the government had given out in lieu of the traditional rice stipend, or that went bankrupt because they had no skill but fighting. Other samurai
Think about that. If not only you, but the generations that came before you have only ever been raised learning one real skill, and that's to be a part of the warrior class, and you haven't really ever had to rely on farming and industry and having a skill like making baskets or making pottery or, working as a mason. What do you do when suddenly that's taken away from you?
Formed a new political party, the Popular Rights Movement, which pushed for a more democratic model and a constitution. Sporadic samurai rebellions gripped the country. In several, disaffected samurai stormed castles, wearing antiquated armor and carrying swords just to prove a point.
Yeah, this is a great point that they make here, and we've been alluding to this all the way along, right? That the samurai are using traditional armor and weapons as a political statement, not because they didn't have access to or know how to use more modern weapons.
The modernized Imperial army had little trouble with them. By 1876, Satsuma had effectively seceded from the rest of Japan. The governor refused to implement land reforms and taxes. Samurai openly wore their swords and top knots, and the military students were effectively a paramilitary force waiting for the order to rise. Tokyo was worried enough that it dispatched a group of spies, Tokyo police officers, to report on what was going on. But it backfired. The commander of the network got captured and, under torture, gave a dubious confession that his group had been ordered to assassinate Saigo. The prefecture boiled over.
And this is the kind of thing that pushes people into open rebellion, right? They've been making political statements. They've been defiant but not rebellious. And now when it seems like the government is coming after them, that's going to push them over the edge.
And an Imperial ship was sent to try to remove ammunition from the Satsuma armory so that it couldn't be used to arm rebels.
The parallels here with the American Revolution are stark, right? You have people who are unhappy with what they see as the government overstepping its bounds and stepping on their rights. And you have acts by what is viewed as a tyrannical government that push people to radicalism. And then you go after the weapons.
They were too late. The Satsuma Rebellion had started, and Saigo came out of retirement to lead it. But he was careful about his language. Saigo wore his Imperial Army uniform.
Again, you rebel against the government, not against the emperor.
To show that he was loyal to the emperor, but disagreed with Okubo and the rest of the court. And his stated goal was simple. They would march to Tokyo so he could ask questions of the government. And his army consisted entirely of samurai, carrying...
There's so many parallels here with some of the rebellions that happened throughout medieval England, where people were constantly rebelling against the government, but never against the monarch, at least not till later. It was always against his terrible advisors who were leading him astray.
Swords and seized rifles from the arsenal. Commoners were forbidden even from joining the baggage train. The samurai, with 100 rounds of ammunition each, would carry all the food they would need. His first task was to force the gates at Kumamoto Castle. There were only 3,800 Imperial troops defending it, plus 600 police officers. Saigo's army outnumbered them 2-1. Plus, he knew their commander, Major General Tani Tateki, a former samurai who had fought with Saigo during the Boshin War. Saigo's army would take them easily, or so he thought. On February 19th, 1877, the Imperial troops fired the first shots of the war. Saigo unleashed a 2-day assault on the breastworks surrounding the 270-year-old castle, but the peasant conscripts held, weathering his artillery barrages, battling against the studied swordsmanship of the samurai with their lug-mounted bayonets.
And this, as much as anything, is going to be one of the major impacts of this conflict, is just the fact that it shows that this peasant army, these non-career soldiers who didn't grow up as part of the samurai warrior class, with modern weapons are able to be effective on the battlefield against people who have been trained from childhood to be warriors.
Not to mention, they were cunning. Saigo's artillery would clear a breach in their earthwork forts and then send in a storming party of samurai, only to see them torn apart by landmines. By the second day, the Imperial troops were mauled and low on ammunition, but they had significantly damaged Saigo's forces. They pulled back inside the castle, and Saigo dug in for a siege. For weeks, Saigo lost artillerymen to wall snipers. The February cold froze the ground, and inside the fortress, men were starving, running nearly dry of ammunition. But Saigo's army kept getting bigger, his nebulous mission attracting disaffected samurai from all over. 10,000 men became 20,000. Then the Imperial army arrived to relieve the siege, and Saigo split his forces, leaving 5,000 men around the castle, and taking 15,000 to meet the Imperial army.
How often has this happened, right? By delaying the Satsuma rebels until the government mounted a response, the Kagoshima garrison arguably won the war. How often has that happened? A small force that holds out way longer than anybody anticipated is able to buy time for their side to mount an effective response.
March 3rd, 1877, the road to Kumamoto. In a pouring rain, an Imperial force of 90,000 attacks Saigo's samurai. Men slip on the grass, battling in the mud of trenches and positions. Saigo's rifles, primarily muzzleloaders, are so waterlogged they won't fire.
And why does this matter, muzzleloaders? Because by the time you're into the late 1870s, most modern weapons are breech loaders. And why that matters is it's a lot faster to load from the breech, from the back of a weapon, than it is to have to set it down, load from the muzzle. And, instead of being able to fire 2 or 3 shots a minute with a muzzleloader, you can fire much more effectively, much more efficiently with a breech loader.
Forcing the samurai to fight with blades. Every day, the situation worsens. Skirmishes turn to full assaults. The dead stack up. In a 17-day battle, 4,000 men are killed on each side, nearly as many as the entire Boshin War. Then, Saigo got word that the Imperial troops had landed in his home city of Kagoshima, which meant that even if he won both the battle and the siege, his army was now adrift. He sent a peace offer to the Imperial army. It was rejected. So he abandoned the siege at Kumamoto.
And this is the problem with when you've adopted a policy of forgiveness and pardons for people who have previously rebelled, and then you face a new rebellion, whether it's from the same people or different people. At this point, very often, pardons and forgiveness, that's not going to work anymore. Now you've got to make a statement.
The castle, which had held out 52 days, and retreated. Saigo and his forces essentially went on the run. He'd drop off a few units to slow down pursuers with guerrilla tactics before drawing up for another clash. And at times, he escaped encirclement with such cunning that dissident press began to treat him as a Robin Hood-like hero. An old samurai standing up for Japanese values against reform and modernization.
And at this point, that's really all he has left, right, is to make this last stand. That's where we're going to talk about the last samurai, the last stand at Shirayama, and go out as exactly who you claim to be all along and demonstrate to Japan, this is what a warrior does. This is the heart of the warrior class. This is the samurai, and this is what you're losing.
But there was no strategy, no objective. This was now theater, a way to prove a point about his own samurai virtue. He was forced to abandon his firearms and artillery and slipped home to stage his last stand in Kagoshima. Now here he was, holding a mountain with 500 men, with an army of 30,000 soldiers below in prepared fortifications.
Outnumbered 60 to 1, right? I mean, if you've heard the Sabaton song, Shirayama, 60 to 1. Fantastic song.
He refused their offer for him to surrender. At 4 a.m., his samurai charged the Imperial army with swords, rushing down the mountainside into the blast of cannons and crack of rifles. They hit the Imperial line, and for a moment, katanas flashed, their swordsmanship driving the Imperials back. But Saigo had been hit, the bullet shattering his pelvis. His second-in-command cut off his head, covering up the fact that Saigo was too horrifically wounded to commit seppuku. Then he turned, and with the last 40 men, charged into the guns once more. It was the end of an era. Saigo Takamori, one of the 3 great nobles, had martyred himself against the government he'd helped create. And ironically, the other 2 great nobles would fall with him.
I love just the little details thinking about the Sabaton song, right? To the dawn they hold on, only 40 are left at the end. None alive, none survive, Shirayama.
Kaido had died of an illness months before, and 8 months after Saigo's death, ex-samurai assassinated Akubo not far from where Ii Naosuke had died. The samurai were well and truly gone. But their legend endured. Barely a decade later, the Emperor would pardon Saigo, holding him up as an example of Bushido and commitment to Japanese values.
And this is a smart move, a PR move by the Emperor, is appeal to your history, to your legacy, now that the threat is removed. Now you're in a place where you can praise him as being noble and representing the virtues of Japan.
Such heroes were precious to what increasingly came to replace the old samurai order.
Right.
Nationalism. Soldiers were encouraged to see themselves as samurai, as Japan launched an era of aggressive imperialism alongside the most rapid industrialization campaign in history. And some samurai, unlike Saigo, even navigated that change. Because remember a few episodes ago when we talked about the bombardment at Kagoshima? When samurai with black powder cannons walked into the surf, waving their katanas at the British ship? Well, you might know this one right here. That's Togo Heihachiro. And while only 13 then, in 1905, he would lead a modernized Japanese fleet to crush the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima, showing that while the samurai were gone, their spirit never died.
All right, that was good. I learned a whole lot. I hope you did too. Let's add to the conversation down below. And if you have a recommendation for something you'd like to see me take a look at, just let me know in the comment section. Just don't post a link because YouTube filters out the links. Just tell me what the channel name is and what the video is, and I'll check it out. I want to thank a couple of my fellow Ohioans for your support on Patreon. Alex in Cincinnati and Noah in Dublin, Ohio. Thank you both so much.